The light that came through the grillwork windows of the Utica State Lunatic Asylum on a January morning in 1850 fell in long. Even bars across the stone floor of the Eastern Corridor. The building occupied a rise above the Mohawk Valley in central New York, visible from the Turnpike Road for the better part of a mile, a structure of considerable mass built in the Italianate manner, with a central administration block and two lateral wings that extended north and south, each containing the wards that housed several hundred patients the institution referred to in its published annual reports as inmates. Inside, the corridors were cool and dim, even when the coal furnaces in the basement ran through the night, and the sounds that moved through those passageways were particular sounds of institutional life. The measured footsteps of attendants making their rounds, the low turn of iron locks, and from the farther wards, when the morning was still, the sustained and sometimes wordless sounds of people who had lived in the same rooms through the previous autumn and winter, without meaningful change to the circumstances of their confinement. Across the eastern and midwestern states in those middle decades of the 19th century, dozens of institutions of this kind had been built or were under construction, funded by state legislatures that had been persuaded, largely through the sustained campaigning of the reformer Dorothea Dix, that the mentally ill belonged in organized hospitals rather than jails and county poorhouses. The physicians who ran these places believed, and said so openly in their published reports, that the buildings themselves were capable of healing. This channel covers histories of this kind on a regular basis, and a subscription helps that work continue. What follows is drawn from the institutional records, case notes, government inquiries, and surviving testimony that document what life inside these places actually looked like across more than 8 decades. The idea that a building could heal a person, that its proportions, its ventilation, its gardens, and the arrangement of its corridors could accomplish what neither pharmaceutical agents nor physical restraints had managed for centuries, was not native to the American continent. It arrived, as so many of the intellectual frameworks of 19th century American medicine did, from Europe, carried across the Atlantic in the published reports and private correspondence of physicians who had studied what was happening in Paris and in the north of England, and who returned convinced that the treatment of mental illness had been fundamentally misunderstood for generations. These physicians returned with something closer to a moral argument than a strictly medical one, that the physical conditions in which the mentally ill had been held were not merely unfortunate, but causally implicated in the severity of the illness itself, and that changing those conditions would change the course of the disease. Whether this argument was correct in its particulars, it was consequential in its effects, and the physical institutions it produced would define the experience of mental illness in America for the better part of a century. In Paris, during the final decade of the 18th century, Philippe Pinel had begun a series of reforms at the Bicêtre Hospital that would become foundational to the subsequent history of institutional psychiatry on both continents. Pinel was appointed physician-in-chief of the Bicêtre in 1793, an institution that housed several hundred patients in conditions that had been standard across European hospitals for generations. Men chained to stone walls in individual cells, without regular access to outdoor space or natural light, managed primarily through physical constraint and, in cases of acute agitation, through methods of punishment that the era considered neither unusual nor inappropriate for individuals who had lost the use of their reason. What Pinel argued, first in practice and then in his published writing, was that mental illness was a disorder of the nervous system and the moral faculties that was amenable to treatment through an ordered, regulated institutional environment, that the chains were not a form of management but an obstacle to recovery. His treatise on mental alienation, which appeared in 1801 under a title that translates broadly as a philosophical inquiry into that condition, formalized these arguments in a systematic medical text that was rendered into English within a few years and read closely across the Atlantic by physicians who found in it a theoretical foundation they had been searching for. The unchaining of patients at the Bicêtre, which Pinel carried out in stages beginning 1793, produced results that he documented with sustained and methodical care. Patients who had been considered permanently and dangerously disordered became, under conditions of relative freedom, supervised daily activity, and regular provision of food and warmth, considerably more manageable. Some recovered well enough to be discharged. Pinel was careful not to overstate what he had observed. He continued to endorse physical restraint when he judged it clinically necessary, and did not abandon the cold bath or other physical interventions as medical tools. But the core claim, that the physical and social conditions of the institution shaped clinical outcomes in ways that were documentable and potentially subject to improvement through deliberate design, was stated with sufficient precision, and supported with sufficient case evidence to make it difficult to dismiss or to ignore. In England, and at almost exactly the same period, a Quaker merchant in York named William Tuke was advancing a closely related argument through entirely different means. The founding of the York Retreat in 1796 followed the death of a Quaker woman named Hannah Mills inside the York Asylum under circumstances that neither Tuke nor his associates in the Society of Friends found adequately explained, and that the asylum's governing board declined to investigate with any transparency. Tuke had no medical training and made no medical claims. His response was practical and institutional. He proposed the founding of a dedicated facility that would operate on principles of Quaker kindness, mutual accountability, and structured domestic routine rather than under the authority of professional medicine. And a retreat that opened on a country property outside the city was built to resemble a substantial farmhouse rather than a hospital or a prison. The regime it offered included supervised walks on the grounds, gardening, organized occupations of a domestic character, and a deliberate effort to make patients feel that they live in a community governed by recognizable social rules rather than in an institution governed entirely by medical authority. Samuel Tuke, William's grandson, published a careful account of the retreat's operating philosophy and its results in 1813 under the title Description of the Retreat, and this text became one of the most widely read and frequently cited documents in the early American asylum movement. The American physicians and reformers who read it found in the York Retreat a model that confirmed what they wished to believe, that human beings who had lost the normal use of their rational faculties could, with patient and systematic management in an appropriately designed environment, recover those faculties more reliably than any amount of bloodletting or physical restraint had produced. The retreat's mortality rates were lower than those of comparable institutions. Its published accounts of patient outcomes, while imperfect in their methodology, were more favorable than what the conventional hospital literature was reporting in the same period. American readers drew from this the broad conclusion that the institution, its physical character, its daily routines, its built environment, was itself the therapeutic instrument, the physician whose influence on American psychiatry would most closely parallel, and in certain practical respects most thoroughly exceed, that of Pinel in France was Benjamin Rush of Philadelphia, who had signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and who by the early 19th century held the principal medical professorship at the University of Pennsylvania and a senior clinical position at the Pennsylvania Hospital. Rush published Medical Inquiries and Observations upon the Diseases of the Mind in 1812, a text that is accurately described as the first systematic American treatise on mental illness, though the description perhaps understates the degree to which the book is also a text of genuine theoretical tension. Rush argued with conviction that mental illness was a physical disease rooted in disturbances of the cerebral blood vessels, and that its treatment was therefore a legitimate province of medicine rather than a religion or moral philosophy, an argument that, whatever its subsequent limitations, was reformist in its moment because it transferred authority over the mentally ill from the jail keeper and the clergyman to the physician. Rush's own therapeutic methods were, by any later standard of evaluation, considerably less coherent than his theoretical framework. He used bloodletting and purgatives on the theory that removing excess stimulation from the circulatory system would correct the disturbed states of the brain that produced mental disorder. He invented a device he called the tranquilizing chair, which strapped patient immobile into a seated position with a wooden box enclosed in the head, on the ground that reducing muscular movement and sensory input would calm overexcited nerves. He also endorsed a gyrating chair that rotated patients at speed on the opposed theory that centrifugal redistribution of blood from the extremities toward the head might produce the same corrective effect through opposite means. These instruments were used in Rush's own practice without apparent consciousness of the theoretical contradiction between them, and what unified them was not any shared physiological mechanism, but their shared institutional setting. All were medical procedures performed in a hospital ward, and the hospital, not the jail, not the poorhouse, not the family home, was, Rush maintained, the appropriate and necessary location for any serious engagement with the diseases of the mind. The institutions founded in the decade and a half following Rush's 1812 publication reflected his arguments in their organizational principles and official aspirations, even where their actual practice fell short of their stated aims. The McLean Asylum, which opened in Charlestown, Massachusetts, in 1818 under the affiliation of Massachusetts General Hospital, accepted patients of relative means in a setting designed to approximate the character of a well-ordered private household. Supervised daily occupation, organized meal times, regulated walks on the surrounding grounds, and a stable institutional routine that replaced the chaos of the patient's previous environment with something consistent and predictable. The Bloomingdale Asylum opened in New York City in 1821 on a site considerably north of the city's settled edge, on elevated ground that provided the open, aerated character that moral treatment theory considered essential to recovery. The Hartford Retreat, founded in Connecticut in 1824 through the sustained effort of local physicians and civic leaders who had read Samuel Tuke's account of the York Retreat, stated plainly in its founding documents that its purpose was curative rather than custodial. What moral treatment looked like in practice at these early American institutions was, in its formal organization, more structured and in specific provisions more humane than what had preceded it. Patients at the McLean Asylum in the 1820s and 30s had access to a small library, to newspapers, to musical instruments, and to supervised outdoor exercise on the grounds surrounding the building. The Hartford Retreat maintained a garden that patients with appropriate supervision could cultivate. The Bloomingdale Asylum published annual reports documenting admissions, lengths of stay, and patient outcomes, one of the earliest sustained attempts in American medicine to measure institutional performance with statistical consistency. The cost of this care, however, placed it well beyond the reach of the great majority of mentally ill Americans. A patient at the McLean Asylum in the early 1830s paid between $4 and $10 per week for their care, at a period when an unskilled laboring man earned less than $5 for a full 6-day working week. The reform that moral treatment represented had been conducted, in its first decades, almost entirely on behalf of and for the benefit of those who could afford to purchase it. The campaign that extended institutional care beyond this narrow population originated not with a physician, but with an educator. Dorothea Lynn Dix, born in Hampton, Maine in 1802, had worked as a teacher and writer before a period of illness, and residence in England in the late 1830s brought her into sustained contact with the reform ideas associated with the York Retreat and with the Quaker Philanthropic Network that had continued to extend its influence since William Tuke's founding of that institution. In the winter of 1842, she was invited to teach a Sunday school class at the East Cambridge House of Correction in Massachusetts, and encountered, in a section of the building separate from those housing criminal offenders, a number of mentally ill individuals confined in unheated cells without any accommodation specific to their condition beyond the basic provision of food and physical confinement. She was told by the facilities keeper that the insane did not feel cold. She found this claim medically unsubstantiated and conditions she had seen unacceptable, and she began a survey of existing provision for the mentally ill across Massachusetts that would occupy the next year and a half of her life. Over that period, Dix visited every jail, almshouse, and county poorhouse in the state to which she could gain access, and she documented what she found in terms that were deliberately factual and deliberately specific. The memorial she submitted to the Massachusetts State Legislature in January of 1843 opened with an account that would be quoted extensively in the decades that followed. I proceed, gentlemen, briefly to call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this Commonwealth, in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. The legislature responded by appropriating additional funds to the expansion of the Worcester State Lunatic Hospital, and Dix repeated the same process across New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Tennessee, North Carolina, and the southern and western states in the following 2 decades, filing comparable memorials with each state legislature and, in most cases, achieving comparable institutional results. The argument she made to each legislature was calibrated to address practical concerns alongside humanitarian ones. She did not rest the case on moral appeal alone, but presented figures drawn from the early institutions suggesting that patients treated promptly in a properly equipped hospital had measurable rates of recovery, and she argued that a recovered patient who returned to productive life represented a lesser long-term burden on the public purse than a patient who remained indefinitely in a poorhouse or jail at the county's expense. This argument, that the asylum was fiscally rational as well as morally correct, was persuasive to legislators who might have resisted a purely humanitarian case, and the institution building it set in motion over 2 decades created an unprecedented demand for authoritative professional guidance on how state hospitals should be designed, organized, and managed. Thomas Story Kirkbride was born in Morrisville, Pennsylvania, in 1809 into a Quaker farm family, and he completed his medical degree at the University of Pennsylvania in 1832, subsequently serving for a period at the Friends Asylum in Frankfort, Pennsylvania, before accepting the superintendency of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane in Philadelphia in 1840. He would hold that position for the remaining 43 years of his life until his death in 1883, and from it he would exercise, through sustained institutional practice, prolific professional correspondence, and his central position in the organization that coordinated American psychiatry's collective expertise and influence over the design of American asylum buildings that has no real parallel in the period. The Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane was founded in Philadelphia in October of 1844 by 13 physicians who held senior positions at the principal American asylums of the moment. Among the founders were Amaria Brigham, superintendent of the New York State Lunatic Asylum at Utica, and the first editor of the American Journal of Insanity, which the association launched in the same year, Samuel Bayard Woodward, who had presided over the Worcester State Lunatic Hospital in Massachusetts since its founding in 1833, Pliny Earle, then serving at the Bloomingdale Asylum, and Isaac Ray, who was shortly to assume the superintendency of the Butler Hospital for the Insane in Providence, Rhode Island, having previously directed the main insane hospital in Augusta. The association's founding documents specified that it would meet annually to consider the general interests of the insane, and its proceedings, published with regularity over the following decades, became the primary professional record through which American asylum medicine understood and debated its own purposes and methods. The American Journal of Insanity that the association launched in 1844, a publication that would eventually be renamed the American Journal of Psychiatry, and continues today as the oldest continuously published psychiatric journal in the United States, served as the primary vehicle through which Kirkbride's architectural thinking circulated within the profession. His annual reports from the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane were produced in a form considerably more detailed than what most contemporary institutions offered, covering not only patient statistics but building dimensions, ward arrangements, staffing levels, and ventilation measurements. Kirkbride contributed papers on construction, patient classification, institutional administration, and the practical relationships between spatial design and clinical outcomes to the journal's pages across several decades, and these contributions were read with close attention by superintendents across the country who were facing, with varying degrees of legislative support, the practical problem of building and managing state hospitals for patient populations far larger than those of the early private institutions. In 1854, Kirkbride formalizes accumulated thinking in a treatise published in Philadelphia by the Association on construction, organization, and general arrangements of hospitals for the insane. The document addressed, in systematic and at times exhausting detail, every material aspect of asylum design, from the geological character of a building site to the appropriate dimensions of basement corridors. Its central prescription was a linear plan, a building organized around a central administration block from which wings extended on either side, each wing set back slightly behind the one immediately adjacent to the center, creating a structure that spread outward from its core in a pattern of graduated steps. The stagger was not a stylistic decision, but a functional one. Each ward received natural light and unobstructed fresh air from its forward face, and the noise and smell associated with the most disturbed patients, always placed in the outermost rooms at the ends of the building's arms, would not travel directly through and towards housing more settled individuals. The classification of patients within the wings was as carefully specified as the layout itself. Women occupied the wings on one side of the building, men the other. Within each half, patients were assigned to floors and individual rooms based on the assessed severity of their condition, with the most acutely disturbed housed in reinforced rooms at the building's outer reaches, and those considered convalescent or mildly disordered placed in the interior sections with access to more varied supervised occupation. Patient rooms were specified at a minimum of 8 feet by 12 feet, each with a window and a door opening onto a shared central corridor connecting the ward to the institutional core. No single ward was to hold more than 20 to 25 patients, and the total population of any institution built on this plan, a point Kirkbride returned to with notable emphasis, was not to exceed 250. Beyond that number, the necessary personal relationship between the physician superintendent and each individual patient, which Kirkbride considered the essential mechanism of the therapeutic process, could not, in his judgment, be sustained. The grounds surrounding the building received specifications as detailed as those governing its internal arrangement. The site was to be elevated, with open views across the surrounding land rather than onto roads or commercial structures. Working farms were to adjoin the main building, providing supervised outdoor occupation for patients capable of physical labor and reducing the institution's dependence on purchased provisions. Gardens maintained closer to the building offered opportunities for less demanding outdoor activity for a broader range of patients. The visual character of the approach to the institution, the manner in which the building first presented itself to an arriving patient, was, in Kirkbride's analysis, a medical consideration of real importance. A structure of ordered and settled appearance, what his treatise described as a cheerful and comfortable appearance, would communicate to the newly arrived patient, before any physician had spoken a word, that they had entered a place of purposeful and benevolent order rather than of punitive confinement, and that first communication was itself understood to be the beginning of the therapeutic process. The building, in this formulation, was not the container for the treatment. It was the treatment itself. This conviction, that architectural space exerted clinical effects as direct and as real as any drug or physical procedure, gave the Kirkbride plan its professional authority and its remarkable geographic reach. Between the publication of the treatise in 1854 and the end of the century, more than 70 institutions in the United States were designed wholly or substantially along his linear plan, among them the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in what would become West Virginia, the Kalamazoo State Hospital in Michigan, the Athens Lunatic Asylum in Ohio, the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, and the Napa State Hospital in California. Each of these represented a significant investment of public funds, and each embodied, in its corridors and its wings and its carefully positioned grounds, the theoretical claim that design space could be the primary instrument of mental transformation. What that claim would encounter in the coming decades, the rising admissions, the shrinking per patient appropriations, the violence that accumulated in wards that were never meant to hold the numbers they eventually contained, was an unresolved tension built into the walls from the beginning, and it belonged to the same story these buildings have been telling since the first of their foundation stones was set. The Kirkbride plan specified in some detail the dimensions and placement of the reception hall, the room at the front of the central administration block, where newly admitted patients were first received, assessed, and assigned to a ward. In the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, which Kirkbride himself administered, this room was proportioned and furnished in a manner intended to communicate to both patient and any accompanying family members the ordered and purposeful character of the hospital they had entered. What the architectural plan could not specify, because it lay beyond the province of building design, was what formal conditions had to be met, what legal threshold had to be crossed, before a person could legitimately be brought to stand in that room. That question belonged to medicine and to law. And across the 19th century United States, the answers that medicine and law together provided were, in ways that were not always immediately apparent, significantly easier to satisfy than the therapeutic ideals enshrined in the buildings designed to receive whoever those answers produced. The legal framework governing the commitment of individuals to state asylums varied from state to state across the middle decades of the century, but in most jurisdictions to the late 1870s, the formal threshold was low and the procedural protections were minimal. In most states, a certificate signed by one or two physicians was sufficient to authorize indefinite commitment, and the standard those physicians were required to apply was rarely defined with precision in statute. The common law concept of lunacy, broadly, a condition that rendered a person unable to manage their own affairs, provided some theoretical boundary, but in practice, the category of individuals who could be certified as lunatic under this standard was wide enough to accommodate a range of social, behavioral, and economic circumstances that would not, under any later framework, constitute grounds for involuntary psychiatric hospitalization. There was no requirement in most states that the certifying physicians had examined the patient in any systematic way, no mandatory waiting period, no mechanism of independent review, and no formal appeal process available to the person being committed. The physicians who ran these institutions contributed to the situation not through negligence but through conviction. Isaac Ray, whose 1838 publication, A Treatise on the Medical Jurisprudence of Insanity, was the most authoritative American legal medical text of the period, argued consistently that restrictive commitment laws did more harm than good, because they delayed the treatment of individuals who required institutional care during the interval when their illness was most susceptible to intervention. Ray maintained that the physician was better placed than a judge or a jury to evaluate whether an individual required hospitalization, and that the introduction of formal legal proceedings into what was essentially a medical question would expose vulnerable patients to public scrutiny at the most difficult moments of their lives while providing only an illusion of protection. This argument was widely shared within the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, and it meant that the profession whose expertise was cited as justification for commitment proceedings was simultaneously the profession most actively opposed to subjecting those proceedings to external oversight. The consequences of this arrangement were most apparent in the extraordinary breadth of what the published records of American asylums identified as the precipitating causes of mental disorder. Every institution produced annual reports, and most of these included tables listing the causes to which the admitting physicians attributed each patient's condition. The American Journal of Insanity compiled and compared these tables across multiple institutions, and the categories they contained appeared with remarkable consistency across decades of publication. Among the causes listed in the annual reports of the New York State Lunatic Asylum at Utica, the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, and the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, one finds entries for domestic trouble, grief, disappointment in love, religious excitement, business failure, loss of property, fright, jealousy, overwork, and immigration. These were understood not as descriptions of mental states, but as causal accounts, records of what the physician believed had produced the patient's illness. But in practice, the boundary between the precipitating cause and the clinical symptom was regularly collapsed in ways that made the documentation of either unreliable. Masturbation appeared in these tables with a frequency that reflected the period's settled conviction that self-stimulation was both a cause and a symptom of mental disorder. The belief had respectable European antecedents. The Swiss physician Samuel Auguste Tizot had published a widely translated medical treatise on its dangers as early as 1760, and it was endorsed by Benjamin Rush and incorporated into American medical education during the first decades of the 19th century. By mid-century, masturbation occupied a position in the institutional literature comparable to excessive alcohol use. Not the only cause of insanity, but one of the most commonly cited, and one whose identification in a patient's history serves simultaneously to explain the condition and to justify the admission. Novel reading appeared less frequently, but was present in the records of multiple institutions, applied particularly to women, on the theory that excessive imaginative stimulation weakened the moral and nervous constitution in ways that predisposed toward disorder. Political excitement appeared in records from the turbulent years around the Civil War, applied to men whose level of engagement with public affairs was judged to have exceeded what nervous stability could sustain without damage. The category of moral insanity, formulated by the English physician James Cowles Pritchard in his 1835 treatise on insanity and other disorders affecting the mind, and imported rapidly into American practice, extended the diagnostic reach of institutional psychiatry still further. Pritchard defined moral insanity as a condition in which the moral and active faculties were disordered, a persistent deviation from the norms of rational social conduct, without any corresponding impairment of the intellectual powers. A person could display entirely coherent reasoning, hold intact memory, and engage articulately with any subject presented, and yet still fall within the definition of moral insanity if their behavior, their social attitudes, or their moral conduct diverge sufficiently from what the examining physician considered normal. The American superintendents who adopted this category found it useful precisely because it extended their professional authority to individuals who would not have qualified as disordered under any purely intellectual standard of lunacy, and the adoption of the category was largely unchallenged within the professional literature until well into the 1860s. For married women in particular, the gap between legal protection and actual vulnerability was sharpest. In most American states through the early 1870s, a married woman possessed, under the legal doctrine of coverture, no independent legal standing. Her person, her property, and her legal identity were subsumed within those of her husband. In Illinois, prior to 1867, the state statute governing the commitment of insane persons contained a provision that had no direct parallel in most other jurisdictions. A married woman could be admitted to the state hospital on the certificate of her husband alone, without the signature of any physician, and without any judicial proceeding whatsoever. The husband's assertion of his wife's insanity was, under the statute, legally sufficient grounds for her indefinite institutionalization. It required a woman named Elizabeth Parsons wear Packard to make this provision visible to a public audience in terms that could not be easily dismissed. Packard was born in Ware, Massachusetts, in 1816 and married the Reverend Theophilus Packard, a Calvinist minister of the Old School Presbyterian tradition, in 1839. By the late 1850s, serious theological disagreements had developed between them. Elizabeth had moved toward the view, influenced partly by Methodist theological writing, that human beings possess an innate capacity for spiritual development that Calvinist doctrine, with its emphasis on predestination and innate depravity, did not adequately recognize. She expressed these views in the Sunday school class she taught at her husband's church in Montino, Illinois, and Theophilus Packard found his wife's theological positions incompatible with his own pastoral standing. On the morning of the 18th of June, 1860, he arranged for her to be removed from their home by the county sheriff and committed to the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane at Jacksonville without any hearing, without any prior medical examination, and without any notice given to his wife that such a proceeding was being contemplated. Packard was held at Jacksonville for 3 years, during which time she wrote extensively in private notebooks, engaged in determined advocacy for other patients she considered wrongly confined, and maintained a correspondence with family members and sympathetic individuals outside the institution. Andrew McFarland, the superintendent at Jacksonville, maintained throughout her confinement that she was insane, characterizing her religious opinions as evidence of disordered moral and intellectual faculties of the kind that the diagnosis of moral insanity was designed to encompass. She was discharged in June of 1863, not through any formal clinical review of her case or any institutional reassessment of her condition, but because her husband, exercising the same statutory authority that had authorized her admission, requested her release. Upon her return to the family home in Montino, Theophilus Packard locked her in an upstairs room and nailed the windows shut. It was the intervention of neighbors and friends that resulted in a writ of habeas corpus being sought on her behalf. The hearing that followed was held in January of 1864 in Kankakee County, Illinois, before Judge Charles Starr. A jury of 12 men heard testimony from physicians, from neighbors who had known Elizabeth Packard for years, and from Packard herself, and they deliberated for 7 minutes before returning a verdict that she was sane. The finding resulted in no formal sanction against her husband, no review of Andrew McFarland's conduct as superintendent, and no legal action of any kind against the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane at Jacksonville. What it produced, instead, was newspaper coverage across several states, and in Packard herself, a determination to devote the remainder of her life to reforming the statutes that had permitted her confinement. Packard published her account of the Jacksonville years in 2 volumes, Marital Power Exemplified in Mrs. Packard's Trial, which appeared in 1866, and The Prisoner's Hidden Life, or Insane Asylums Unveiled, published in 1868. She traveled to state capitals and testified before legislative committees, framing her argument not in terms of individual grievance, but in terms of the structural conditions that made individual cases like hers possible. The Illinois Personal Liberty Law of 1867, enacted in the session during which Packard presented her testimony and signed by Governor Richard James Oglesby, required that any person sought to be committed to an asylum must be given a hearing before a jury of 12 persons, and that no commitment could proceed without a finding of insanity by that jury. It was the most protective commitment statute enacted by any American state to that date, and it was received within the profession of asylum medicine as an unwelcome intrusion of legal procedure into medical judgment. Isaac Ray, responding to the reform movement Packard represented, argued in print that jury proceedings in commitment cases risked the cruel exposure of an unfortunate patient's derangement and would deter families from seeking timely institutional care. Packard continued from Illinois to Iowa, to Massachusetts, to Maine, and to several other states, achieving in each, to varying degrees, legislative changes that impose new procedural requirements on the commitment process. The populations most affected by the ease of commitment in the decades before such reforms arrived, however, were not primarily the middle-class married women whose cases attracted newspaper attention. The largest single group of patients in state asylums in the Northeast by the 1850s and 60s was composed of recent immigrants, and particularly of Irish-born men and women who had arrived in the United States during and after the Great Famine of 1845 through 1852. Edward Jarvis, a Massachusetts physician and statistician who surveyed the commitment records of New England institutions for a report published in 1855, found that foreign-born residents of Massachusetts were being committed to state asylums at a rate approximately 4 times that of native-born residents when adjusted for population. His findings were not contested. The superintendents whose institutions reflected this disparity did not, in their published reports, describe it as a condition requiring explanation. The foreign-born population was understood to be more susceptible to mental disorder by virtue of the disruptions of emigration, and what the period's medical literature characterized as a constitutional vulnerability in certain national groups toward nervous instability. The actual mechanisms by which immigrant patients arrived at state institutions were more prosaic than any theory of constitutional predisposition could account for. County poorhouses were the primary feeder institutions for state hospitals across the Northeast and Midwest. Individuals who had arrived in the country without family networks capable of supporting them through illness or unemployment, or who had become too disorganized in their behavior to maintain any independent household, were received by the county poorhouse, and the poorhouse superintendent, with no resources for managing severe behavioral disturbance and under pressure to move cases to more appropriate facilities, would request transfer to the state hospital. The state hospital physician who reviewed the transfer request examined the available documentation and, in most cases, approved the admission. The admission interview, when conducted at all, was carried out in English, which many Irish, German, and Italian patients did not speak with any fluency. The question of whether the patient was experiencing a psychiatric disorder or was in acute distress from poverty, displacement, and physical illness was not systematically distinguished, and the institutional record in most cases did not attempt to make the distinction. The physical process of admission to a Kirkbride plan institution was, in its sequence of steps, thoroughly organized and spatially deliberate. The patient arrived at the main entrance of the building by carriage or, increasingly from the 1860s onward, by rail to the nearest station, and then by conveyance to the grounds. In the reception hall, they were met by the superintendent or by an assistant physician, and, in larger institutions, by the steward and the matron. Their personal clothing and effects were removed, inventoried, and placed in storage. They were then given a physical examination, though it was typically brief, and directed toward identifying obvious organic conditions rather than toward any systematic assessment of mental state. They were provided with institutional clothing, a standardized garment that carried in its very uniformity the first signal that individual identity, within this building, would be subordinated to institutional category, and escorted to the ward that the admitting physician had designated as appropriate. That designation was made on the basis of a classification system that drew on Kirkbride's original architectural logic, but was applied in practice with varying degrees of precision. Patients were broadly sorted into recent cases, those whose illness was of less than 1 year's duration and who were therefore considered candidates for recovery under the therapeutic optimism of the period, and chronic cases, those whose condition had persisted beyond that threshold and who were understood, with varying degrees of frankness in the institutional record, to be unlikely to leave. Within these categories, patients were further sorted by sex, by the degree of behavioral disturbance they presented, and, in institutions that maintained separate wards for paying patients, by economic standing. The ward to which a patient was assigned on the first afternoon of their admission determined, in most cases, the physical space in which they would spend the majority of their time in the institution, and it was a decision made within the first hour of their arrival, on the basis of what a single physician had been able to observe in the course of a brief and often difficult encounter. The gap between what this admission process was understood to be, a careful medical assessment placing each patient in the therapeutic environment most suited to their individual condition, and what was in practice, an efficient sorting procedure shaped by a combination of diagnosis, economics, and the social circumstances that had produced a referral was present from the earliest decades of American asylum medicine. Thomas Kirkbride's own annual reports from a Pennsylvania hospital for the insane acknowledged, with characteristic restraint, that many patients arrive at the institution after their condition had deteriorated beyond the point where any earlier intervention might have altered its course, and that the admission interview therefore captured a patient at their most distressed and least representative. Pliny Earle, writing in the American Journal of Insanity in the 1850s, observed that the causes of insanity listed in institutional annual reports reflected primarily the attending family's account of recent events, shaped by that family's own interests and memories in ways that the receiving physician had no means of independently verifying. The reception hall, with its measured proportions and its air of purposeful order, processed these imperfect accounts into institutional categories, and the ward corridors beyond received whoever the categories produced. What happened in those corridors, the daily schedules, the regulated occupations, the forms of work and supervision that structure the lives of patients who might remain in those wards for months or for the remainder of their lives, was a system that the architectural plans had sketched and outlined, but that the daily realities of institutional operation had filled in with considerably less precision. The daily schedule of a mid-19th century American asylum ward was written out, in most institutions, literally written out, posted on a board in the ward corridor, or reproduced in the published annual report, with a precision that reflected both the therapeutic philosophy underpinning the institution and the practical necessities of managing large numbers of people in a single building. At the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane in Philadelphia, patients in the better-managed wards rose before 6 a.m, dressed in the institutional clothing they had been issued on admission, and assembled for a morning meal served at 7. The work period that followed ran from shortly after breakfast until noon, at which point the main meal of the day was taken. A second, shorter work period occupied much of the afternoon, and the evening hours were designated for what the institutional literature called amusements and relaxation, organized reading in the ward sitting rooms, occasional musical entertainments, and on Sundays a chapel service held in the main building's designated devotional space. Lights went out at 8:30 or 9 in the evening, and the sequence began again the following morning with no alteration in its principal components. The schedule was the same, with minor seasonal variations, every day of the working week. This regularity was not a bureaucratic convenience. It was in the theoretical framework of moral treatment, as American asylum physicians understood and applied it, the central therapeutic instrument, and Thomas Story Kirkbride returned to this principle throughout his published writing, maintaining in his treatise of 1854 that employment of some kind was perhaps the most important auxiliary in the treatment of the insane, and insisting that the daily routine of his institution was as deliberately designed as its floor plan, and that the two formed parts of a single therapeutic system. The argument had been present in Pinel's writing and in Samuel Tuke's account of the York Retreat, that the disordered mind was precisely a mind that had lost its relation to the ordinary rhythms and disciplines of rational social life, and that re-establishing those rhythms through an ordered institutional schedule was a mechanism by which recovery was produced. A patient who rose at a regulated hour, took meals at regulated intervals, occupied themselves with purposeful work during the designated portions of the day, and retired at a regulated time was being subjected, in this understanding, to a form of environmental medicine as legitimate as any drug or physical procedure physician might prescribe. The schedule imposed on the disordered person the outward form of order and, through continued repetition, was expected to restore its inward substance. The work that occupied the largest portion of the institutional day was farming, and this was not incidental to the therapeutic program, but central to it. John Minson Galt of the Eastern Lunatic Asylum in Williamsburg, Virginia, who was among the founding members of the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, and who contributed extensively to the pages of the American Journal of Insanity on questions of institutional management, considered outdoor agricultural labor the most reliable therapeutic tool available to the asylum physician, arguing that the combination of physical exertion in the open air, the engagement of attention in practical tasks with visible and concrete outcomes, and the connection to seasonal natural rhythms that farm work imposed on the worker constituted a form of environmental treatment that no restraint or pharmaceutical agent could replicate. Samuel Bayard Woodward at the Worcester State Lunatic Hospital in Massachusetts made a comparable case in his annual reports documenting that patients engaged in farm labor showed more favorable outcomes than those who remained confined to the wards, and characterizing the institution's farmland as among its most valuable therapeutic resources. These arguments circulated through professional literature with the consistency of settled conviction rather than contested hypothesis, and the annual reports of institutions across the Northeast and Midwest repeated them with enough regularity to suggest that the claim had become, within the profession, something close to axiomatic. The farms that surrounded Kirkbride plant institutions were not small demonstrations of therapeutic principle, but substantial agricultural operations that produced significant quantities of food and, in many cases, contributed measurably to the institution's fiscal accounts. The grounds of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum at Weston, West Virginia, which received its first patients when opened in 1864, included several hundred acres of agricultural land worked by patients under the supervision of farm staff, and the institution's annual reports through the 1870s described its farm output in terms that moved without apparent discomfort between therapeutic language and economic accounting. The Willard Asylum for Chronic Insane at Ovid, New York, which opened in 1869 on the western shore of Seneca Lake, with a specific mandate to receive patients transferred from overcrowded institutions elsewhere in the state, was built around a farm of more than 1,400 acres. Its first superintendent, John Brigham Chapin, reported in his initial annual return that the farm operation was expected to supply the greater portion of the institution's food requirements, and that patient labor in the fields, the dairy, and the kitchen gardens was both the primary daily occupation of the male patient population and a contribution to institutional sustainability that the per diem rates provided by the state were not sufficient to replace. For women, the equivalent of farm labor was domestic work within the building itself. Women patients in most state institutions during this period were employed in the laundry, the kitchen, the sewing room, and the ward cleaning routines that were required to keep a building housing several hundred individuals in reasonable sanitary condition. In larger institutions, these were continuous operations carried out on a scale that required a dependable and available workforce. The laundry at the Utica State Lunatic Asylum in the 1860s processed the bed and table linen of several hundred patients on a weekly cycle. And the capacity to maintain this cycle depended on having a consistent number of women patients whose condition was stable enough to perform the work under supervision. The kitchen operations were similarly dependent on patient participation. The preparation of 3 daily meals for populations that grew at institutions like Utica to 600, 700, and ultimately more than 1,000 individuals required a workforce that the institutions were not funded to hire at any market rate, and patient labor was, in these circumstances, not incidental to the institutional economy, but foundational to it. The therapeutic framing persisted alongside the economic reality, without any apparent sense of contradiction, in the published literature of the period. The annual reports of state hospitals routinely describe the women employed in the laundry and the men working the fields in language that emphasize their engagement with purposeful activity and their progress toward the ordered, self-governing state that constituted health. And the case narratives that asylum physicians publish in the professional journals frequently feature the resumption of domestic or agricultural work as a clinical milestone, evidence that the patient was moving in the right direction. What these accounts address with less candor was a position of patients who had been employed in the institution's domestic or farm operations for years without any corresponding movement toward discharge, those whose labor was genuinely valuable to the institution's functioning and whose continued presence in the building was, from the institution's perspective, not without practical utility. The question of what distinguished therapeutic labor from unpaid institutional servitude, when the work was performed indefinitely by individuals who could not decline it and received nothing for it beyond their maintenance within the building, was not one that the professional literature found occasion to address directly. The daily diet within these institutions varied across the period, across geographic regions, and across the different wards of a single institution, but certain patterns were sufficiently consistent to be identifiable across the surviving records. The morning meal was typically composed of corn porridge or oatmeal bread and a hot beverage identified in most institutional records as coffee, those frequently made from chicory or roasted grain rather than from imported coffee beans. The midday meal, the main meal of the day in most American households of the period, included a serving of meat, typically salt pork, boiled beef, or mutton purchased in bulk and stored in brine, alongside potatoes, turnips, or whatever seasonal vegetables the institution's own farm had produced in sufficient quantity. The evening meal was the lightest: bread, sometimes a thin soup, and tea. In season, the farm's production added fresh vegetables and occasionally fresh fruit to this pattern, but the diet across most of the year was distinguished primarily by its repetition. The same items appearing on the same days of the week with a consistency that was, again, understood by the institution's medical staff as a feature rather than a deficiency, because regularity in diet, like regularity in schedule and in labor, was part of the therapeutic environment. The difference between the diet in the better-paying wards and that in the pauper wards of the same institution was, in most cases, considerable, and was not a matter of institutional indifference, but of acknowledged institutional policy. At the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, where Kirkbride maintained a graduated ward system that charged different weekly rates, ranging from a few dollars per week for the poorest county-supported patients to considerably more for private-paying patients. The patients in the upper classification wards received a diet that included fresh meat served in recognizable cuts, a wider variety of vegetables, and on occasion items that did not appear at the pauper ward tables at all. The patients maintained at county expense in the lower-paying wards received the standard institutional diet without modification. This stratification was typically presented in the annual reports not as an economic division, but as a medically appropriate accommodation of the different physiological constitutions and social expectations of different classes of patient. A framing that was, on its own internal terms, coherent, though its coherence depended on an unexamined equivalence between economic status and presumed constitutional character that the period's medical literature found entirely natural and saw no occasion to question. The material conditions of daily life in the ward extended beyond food and labor to encompass everything that constituted the patient's immediate physical existence. The bed was a narrow iron frame with a straw or hair mattress covered by institutional linen that was laundered on the weekly cycle and was identical to the linen used on every other bed in the ward. The clothing issued to patients on admission was cut to a standard institutional pattern, a pattern for men and a pattern for women, and marked in most institutions with the patient's assigned ward number rather than their name. Personal clothing removed on admission was stored, and Kirkbride's own institutional regulations specified that it was to be returned when the patient was discharged. But in overcrowded institutions with inadequate storage facilities, personal clothing was frequently lost, mixed with other patients' effects, or redistributed among the ward population during the period of confinement. Personal effects, letters, books, photographs, rings, watches, were handled with varying degrees of care depending on the institution and the ward, and the correspondence between patients and family members outside was in most institutions subject to review by the superintendent or an assistant physician before being dispatched or delivered, on the stated ground that correspondence from disturbed patients required editorial judgment to prevent harm to the recipient or embarrassment to the institution. The legal status of a committed patient in most American states prior to the statutory reforms of the late 1870s was not precisely defined, but in practice it approximated that of a ward of the institution with no independent legal standing during the period of confinement. The patient could not leave without authorization. They could not, in most states, vote, execute a valid will, or enter into a contract, and in several states a commitment to an asylum was treated as grounds for the automatic suspension of civil rights that continued until discharge was formally recorded. They were addressed in institutional records by their surname alone, or by their assigned number, and the case notes that physicians maintained describe the patient's behavior, appetite, and demeanor in terms shaped by the physician's clinical judgment rather than by any account the patient offered of their own experience. The patient's testimony about their own condition was considered, within the medical epistemology of the period, an inherently unreliable source of clinical information. The judgment of the attending physician, who had received medical training and who was not personally afflicted, was the authoritative account, and the patient's own narrative was understood as, at best, supplementary and, at worst, as a symptom of the condition it purported to describe. The ward corridor that connected the patient's room to the ward's day room was, in the Kirkbride plan, a specific architectural feature with a specific operational function. It was wide enough for two attendants to pass with a patient between them, lit from windows at each end, and arranged so that a person standing at the corridor's midpoint could see to both its extremities without obstructions, a sight line that made continuous observation of patient movement possible without requiring an attendant to be stationed outside each room. The day room, where patients spent the portions of their time not occupied by work, meals, or sleep, was a single large undifferentiated space furnished with chairs and a central table and, in the better institutions, some provision for reading or light occupation. All patients assigned to a ward occupied the same room regardless of the particular character of their condition, their degree of agitation, or their preference for solitude, and the space itself made no accommodation for these distinctions. It gathered all the patients assigned to it into a single regulated space and held them there for the portions of the day when no other institutional activity claimed them, and the attendant or attendants assigned to the ward were responsible for maintaining whatever degree of order the assembled population required. The airing court, the enclosed outdoor space that Kirkbride's plan specified should join each ward, was a rectangular enclosure bounded by stone or brick walls of 10 to 12 feet in height, typically laid out with a gravel path around the perimeter and a grass center, and opening to the ward interior through a single lockable door. Patients taken out to air were supervised by an attendant and were expected to walk the perimeter path or to sit in the court's interior, and the high walls ensured that no patient could leave the space without authorization, and that no view of the broader grounds or the public road beyond was available to encourage any desire to do so. The architecture of the airing court performed the same function as the architecture of the ward corridor and the day room. It provided a space formerly described as therapeutic, outdoor air, physical movement, engagement with the natural environment, while maintaining the complete containment of the individuals within it. The building did not distinguish at the level of its walls between the patient who required secure confinement and the patient who would not have attempted to leave. It applied the same physical constraints to both, because the institution's therapeutic logic required the management of the population as a whole rather than the accommodation of each person within it as an individual case. The years between 1855 and 1875 produced, in institution after institution, a pressure that the therapeutic program of moral treatment had no mechanism for absorbing and no architectural provision for managing. The population of each hospital grew faster than any corresponding growth in staff, in annual budget, or in physical capacity. The Utica State Lunatic Asylum, which had operated in its first decade with a patient population of approximately 350, held more than 700 by 1865, in a building that had been designed and was still described in its annual reports as a therapeutic environment premised on the careful attention of the physician superintendent to each individual patient's specific condition. The Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, which Kirkbride managed with closer attention to his own 250 patient limit than most of his colleagues managed theirs, was under sustained pressure from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to accept additional transfers from overcrowded county facilities. And in most years of the 1860s and 70s, the census exceeded what his treatise had specified as a threshold beyond which the therapeutic relationship could not be maintained. The Willard Asylum had been founded in 1869 specifically to receive patients classified as chronic, those whom the state's overtaxed acute institutions could no longer accommodate within any active therapeutic frame. And within a decade of its opening, it held more than 1,500 individuals. As the patient population of each institution grew beyond its design capacity, the daily schedule that had been constructed as a therapeutic instrument underwent a characteristic and largely undocumented transformation. The supervised small group activities, the individual walks with attendants, the physician's regular engagement with individual cases, all of which had been practiced at the better managed institutions in their earlier decades, contracted as the number of patients that each staff member was responsible for increased year by year without any equivalent increase in the staffing budget. The farm operations and the laundry continued because they were economically necessary and continued to be described in the annual reports as therapeutic occupations because the theoretical framework that always justified them had not been revised and there was no available alternative language. But the other elements of the moral treatment program, the organized evening amusements, the individual occupational activities, the physician's daily personal engagement with each patient's specific history, became, in overcrowded institutions operating on county per diem rates that had not increased in proportion to the cost of running them, an aspiration rather than a consistent practice. The ward corridor remained. The daily schedule remained. But what filled the hours of that schedule changed in proportion to how crowded the ward had become, and the distance between what the founders of American institutional psychiatry had intended when they wrote their building manuals and their annual reports, and what a patient admitted to a state hospital in 1875 actually found when they were escorted past the reception hall and into the ward to which they had been assigned, was by that point of distance that the professional literature was only beginning, haltingly, to acknowledge. The treatment that an individual received inside a 19th century American asylum occupied a distinct register from the therapeutic program of labor and schedule that organized the ward day. The ward's routines were administered by attendants and governed by the institutional clock. The medical treatment delivered by the physician superintendent or his assistant physicians was administered in a different space, on a different schedule, and under a different kind of authority. In the Kirkbride plan, the treatment room was positioned within the central administration block or in the connecting passage between that block and the first ward, spatially adjacent to both the medical hierarchy's domestic quarters and the patient population governed. And the proximity was not accidental. The room where medicine was administered was a room that expressed most directly the physician's authority over the patient's body, and the instruments and procedures it contained shifted across the decades of the century with considerable variation in type and theoretical rationale. But the structural relationship between the physician and the patient that those instruments and procedures expressed remained largely constant. Benjamin Rush's physical treatments had, by the 1820s and 30s, established a template for what medical intervention in cases of mental disorder was expected to look like. It was directed at the body. It rested on a theory connecting the physiological and the psychological under a single explanatory framework. And it was administered by a physician whose authority over the treatment's evaluation was as complete as his authority over its administration. Rush's tranquilizing chair, in which patients were strapped immobile with their head enclosed in a wooden box to reduce sensory and muscular stimulation, was used at the Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia through the early decades of the century and was described in the medical literature as a therapeutic instrument rather than a form of restraint, on the ground that its physical effect on cerebral blood flow was analogous to the effect of a prescribed compound. Rush believed that immobilization reduced the excitation of the brain by decreasing the circulation of blood to the head, and he presented his chair as a practical application of the same physiological principle that underlay bloodletting and purging. All were methods of reducing the excess stimulation to a nervous system in a state of pathological arousal that his theoretical framework identified as the common mechanism of mental disorder. The framework did not require, and the medical literature of the period did not ask, whether the patient experienced the procedure as therapeutic. The physician's theoretical account of the mechanism was the authoritative account, and the patient's own experience of the treatment was, by definition, a product of the disordered nervous system the treatment had been designed to correct. The shower bath, which appeared in the treatment records of American asylums from the 1820s onward, occupied an ambiguous position in the institutional literature that was characteristic of many interventions that moved between therapeutic claim and punitive application, when ease the institutional record rarely paused to examine. In its formal description, the shower bath was a stream of cold water delivered at pressure over a patient's head and body for a period of several seconds to several minutes, administered on the theory that the physiological shock produced by sudden cold immersion interrupted the nervous excitation underlying acute agitated states and restored the disordered system to a more stable equilibrium. The therapeutic claim had a certain internal coherence within the framework of nervous excitement theory. Cold water produced a sharp physical shock. The shock interrupted the patient's behavioral state, and the interruption, in the physician's observation, frequently produced a period of relative quiet that the attending physician recorded as a favorable clinical response. Whether this quiet was genuine recovery or physical exhaustion or simple compliance with an experience the patient found sufficiently aversive to wish to avoid repeating was not a question the therapeutic logic of the period required the physician to ask, and the institutional records that documented the shower baths use typically noted only the patient's behavioral state before and after the administration, not any assessment of what the patient experienced during it. The turn toward hydrotherapy as a formally elaborated system of treatment came from continental Europe, primarily from physicians in the German-speaking states who had developed, at institutions including the Illinois Asylum in Baden and the Seedbird Asylum in Prussia, a systematic program of water-based interventions claiming superiority over both pharmacological sedation and mechanical restraint. Wilhelm Griesinger, whose 1845 text Mental Pathology and Therapeutics was among the most widely read psychiatric treatises of the century's middle decades, and which was translated into English in 1867, described hydrotherapy as a primary physical treatment available to the asylum physician on the ground that controlled water temperature, could produce reliable and predictable effects on the nervous system's excitatory state. American asylum physicians who had studied in Europe or who followed the translated literature began incorporating hydrotherapy rooms into their institutions from the 1870s onward, and by the 1880s, the presence of such a room, a tiled basement space with multiple bath fixtures and trained attendants to operate them, had become in the institutional literature a marker of medical modernity and professional seriousness. The adoption of these methods allowed American institutions to present themselves to state legislators and to a reform-minded public as practicing medicine at the most current European standard, and the language used to describe hydrotherapy in the annual reports of the period was consistently clinical and technically precise in ways that distinguished it, on the page, from the more visibly coercive practices that had preceded it. The continuous bath, which became among the most discussed hydrotherapeutic procedures in American institutions during the 1880s and 90s, placed a patient in a tub of water maintained at a constant temperature of between 92 and 96 degrees Fahrenheit, close enough to body temperature to produce neither warming nor cooling, for periods that range in different institutional protocols, from several hours to several days. The patient lay in a semi-reclined position supported by a canvas hammock stretched across the tub's interior, and an attendant was stationed beside the bath throughout the procedure to maintain the water temperature with warm additions from an adjacent supply, to monitor the patient's physical condition, and to provide whatever assistance the patient required. The theoretical basis of continuous bath was the claimed sedative effect of prolonged immersion at a neutral temperature. The elimination of the ordinary thermal stimulation provided by air contact was said to reduce the stream of sensory excitation reaching the nervous system and resulting behavioral quiet. Patients in a continuous bath typically lay still and exhibited none of the agitation they had shown on the ward, was presented in institutional reports as evidence of the treatment's therapeutic effectiveness. Considerable practical complications attended the procedure that the theoretical literature addressed with less directness than it addressed the claims of efficacy. The patient confined in a bath for more than a few hours required continuous nursing attendance, was exposed to the physical risks of skin maceration from prolonged immersion, and experienced an involuntary bodily passivity that was, in its objective character, difficult to distinguish from simple physical restraint administered in an aquatic rather than a mechanical form. The wet pack, administered alongside the continuous bath in most institutions that practice systematic hydrotherapy, wrapped the patient in sheets soaked in cold water, covered these with dry blankets, and left the patient in this condition for periods ranging from 20 minutes to several hours. In the cold application, the initial sharp contact of the wet sheet against the skin was said to produce a rapid vasoconstrictive response that reduced peripheral blood flow and redirected circulation toward the internal organs, counteracting the excess peripheral excitation associated with manic and agitated presentations. The gradual warming that occurred as the patient's own body heat elevated the temperature within the wrapping was understood to produce a profuse perspiration that reduced systemic toxins and thereby diminished the nervous excitation those toxins were presumed to maintain. The procedure required the patient to remain immobile and cover for its duration, and the attendant staff who administered it had no practical means of distinguishing, in a resistant patient, between the deliberate application of therapeutic wet pack and the physical restraint of a difficult patient in wet sheets, a boundary the institutional literature did not, as a rule, investigate with much persistence. The pharmaceutical management of asylum patients developed along a parallel track that, over the second half of the century, increasingly intersected with and eventually substantially displaced the physical interventions that the earlier institutional literature had foregrounded. Potassium bromide had been used by the English physician Charles Locock from 1857 as an anticonvulsant in cases of epilepsy, and its pronounced sedative properties, a reliable depression of nervous excitation at doses somewhat above the anticonvulsant range, were quickly identified and applied in asylum settings from the early 1860s onward. The compound was inexpensive to produce, reliably available from pharmaceutical manufacturers, and effective in the operational sense that patients administered doses of between 30 and 60 grains per day became measurably quieter and less physically agitated than they had been before treatment began. Its chronic effects, acne, mental dullness, slurred speech, and the neurological syndrome that later physicians would characterize as bromide toxicity, were documented in case notes across the period, but understood primarily as further expressions of the underlying disorder rather than as consequences of the treatment, and the compound continued to be administered in many institutions on a standing daily basis to substantial portions of the ward population whose agitation made them otherwise difficult to manage. Chloral hydrate arrived in American asylum practice in 1869, the year in which the German chemist Oskar Liebrecht published his experimental findings on the compound's sedative properties, and it spread through American institutions with a speed that reflected both its genuine clinical effectiveness and the pressing operational needs of wards whose patient populations had grown beyond the capacity of purely physical management to reliably control. Chloral hydrate produced in most patients a rapid and reliable induction of sleep or of a sleep-like sedated state, with an onset of approximately 30 minutes after oral administration and a duration of several hours, and its adoption in American asylum practice was essentially immediate following the publication of Liebrecht's findings. Within 5 years of that publication, chloral appeared in the dispensary records of major institutions, including the Utica State Lunatic Asylum, the Government Hospital for the Insane in Washington, and the Western State Hospital in Staunton, Virginia, typically noted in the evening nursing records with dosage in grains and a brief observation of the patient's resulting state. The question of what specific clinical condition the drug was being prescribed to address, which was formally distinct from the question of what behavioral effect it reliably produced in the ward population, was not always clearly separated in the institutional record, and in the overcrowded institutions of the 1870s and 1880s the two questions moved, in practice, toward a working equivalence that the professional literature would take several further decades to examine critically. Formaldehyde, introduced in 1882 by the Italian pharmacologist Vincenzo Cervello and adopted in American institutions within a few years of its synthesis, extended the range of available pharmaceutical sedation and was particularly valued in practice because its strong and distinctive odor made it detectable on a patient's breath, allowing attendant staff to confirm that an administered dose had been consumed. Morphine and other preparations of opium have been used in institutional settings since earlier in the century and continue to be administered for states of acute agitation, severe sleeplessness, and extreme physical distress, typically as laudanum in liquid form or in institutions that had adopted the hypodermic syringe following Alexander Wood's development of the instrument in 1853 as a subcutaneous injection. The combination that became standard in the more crowded institutions of the 1870s and 80s, potassium bromide as a daytime sedative administered on a standing basis to broad portions of the ward population, chloral hydrate or formaldehyde to induce sleep at night, morphine for acute management of severe agitation, constituted the primary medical treatment available to the majority of patients in the lower-paying wards, administered not by a physician in the treatment room, but by the attendant staff under standing orders. These orders were written by physicians who might visit the ward once or twice a week, and they governed the pharmaceutical management of patients the prescribing physician had frequently not examined since their initial admission assessment weeks or months earlier. What the published professional literature addressed was considerably less candid than it addressed the theoretical basis or pharmacology of these compounds, was their relationship to the broader operational problem of managing a large and increasing population with a staff that was not growing in proportion to it. The annual report submitted to state legislatures continued through this period to describe the institution's medical program in terms emphasizing individual clinical assessment and the deliberate matching of specific interventions to specific diagnostic indications. The dispensary records, nursing notes, and attendant shift logs that survive from this period present a picture in which sedating compounds were administered to patients who were agitated, who disturbed other patients, who made noise during the night hours, or who otherwise disrupted the routines of a ward whose smooth operation depended on the behavioral compliance of everyone within it, regardless of whether any physician had examined those particular patients in the days preceding the administration or had formulated any clinical rationale specific to their individual case. Sedation and treatment had become in the daily operational reality of the overcrowded ward, categories that the institutional record treated as interchangeable, and the treatment room whose position in the Kirkbride plan expressed the physician's clinical authority was, in these circumstances, functionally subordinated to the ward whose management it was nominally there to direct. Silas, where Mitchell stood at a considerable institutional distance from the state hospital system and was openly dismissive of the standard of care those institutions offered, yet his work represents one of the most consequential elaborations of the same underlying intellectual tradition in the final decades of the century. Mitchell was born in Philadelphia in 1829 and trained at Jefferson Medical College, subsequently establishing himself as a neurologist with particular interest in conditions of nervous exhaustion in educated women of the professional and upper middle classes, a patient population that sought treatment in private clinical settings and whose care required, in his assessment, resources and methods that no state institution could provide. His rest cure, first described in clinical papers in the early 1870s and elaborated formally in his 1877 publication, Fat and Blood, and How to Make Them, became the most widely discussed treatment for female nervous disorders in the United States and in England in the final decades of the century, cited approvingly in the medical literature, and applied in private practice across both countries. The treatment Mitchell proposed was explicitly contrasted, in his own published writing and in the literature that discussed it, with the overcrowded state institutions whose wards held the patients who could not purchase private care, and this contrast formed part of both the cure's therapeutic rationale and its social meaning. The rest cure required the patient's complete removal from her domestic environment and her placement in a private room attended by a trained nurse rather than by family members, under a regime of absolute bed rest that in its initial phase permitted no physical exertion, no sitting up, no reading, no writing, no receiving of visitors. The dietary component was simultaneously the cure's most unusual feature and, in Mitchell's clinical account, its most therapeutically essential. The patient was fed primarily on whole milk, up to 3 pints daily in the most intensive opening weeks, supplemented gradually with eggs, beef broths, and light solid foods, with the explicit aim of producing a substantial weight gain that Mitchell considered an indicator of restored nervous reserve. The patient's muscles, rendered progressively weaker by enforced inactivity, were maintained by daily massage from the attending nurse and by mild electrical stimulation applied to the major muscle groups, procedures that prevented complete physical deterioration while sustaining the patient in the passive and receptive state that Mitchell considered psychologically essential to the cure's operation. When Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the writer and social reformer, was treated by Mitchell in Philadelphia in 1887 for the depression that followed the birth of her daughter, his prescription upon her discharge was that she should live as domestic a life as possible, limit herself to no more than 2 hours of intellectual activity each day, and never touch pen, brush, or pencil again as long as she lived. Gilman later wrote that following the prescription brought her, within 3 months, to the edge of complete mental collapse, and that she recovered only by abandoning the rest cure's instructions entirely and returning to the intellectual work it had forbidden. The story she drew from the experience, The Yellow Wallpaper, published in 1892, depicted a woman confined to the enforced passivity of a rest cure in a room whose wallpaper she studies with increasing and eventually consuming intricacy, a narrative whose force depends on the reader understanding that the treatment and the collapse it produces are not sequential events but simultaneous ones, and that the inactivity Mitchell prescribed was not the cure's precondition but the condition it created. Mitchell himself, when a copy of The Yellow Wallpaper was sent to him, reportedly observed that it had disturbed him too greatly for him to finish reading it, though this response, if accurately recorded, produced no documented revision of his clinical approach. The rest cure continued to be prescribed in private practice across the English-speaking world well into the following decade. The surgical treatments that developed in the same period moved more directly between the private consulting room, the operating theater, and the asylum ward, and their theoretical basis was continuous with the same intellectual tradition that had produced moral treatment's foundational claim that the patient's physical environment was causally connected to the course of mental disease. The gynecological theories that had accumulated through the middle decades of the century held, with persistence that survived considerable contrary clinical evidence, that disease or dysfunction of the ovaries and uterus produced nervous and mental disturbance through a pathway of irritation transmitted along the nervous system from the pelvic organs to the brain. Isaac Baker Brown, an English surgeon who performed clitoridectomies on women diagnosed with hysteria and epilepsy in the 1860s, and was expelled from the Obstetrical Society of London for this practice in 1867, represented the most extreme British expression of this theory. But he was not without American counterparts who found the general principle plausible even when his specific procedure exceeded what the American professional literature was prepared to endorse. Ovariotomy, the surgical removal of one or both ovaries, was performed on female asylum patients in American institutions from the late 1870s onward, principally in facilities that had surgical capacity or that arranged referral to external surgeons whose published views on the gynecological origins of nervous disorder provided the theoretical basis for the referral. The Alabama State Insane Hospitals were among the institutions where the gynecological surgical approach was applied with regularity in the 1890s, and the published case reports from those institutions documented procedures performed on patients whose stated surgical indication was the mental or nervous disorder itself, rather than any identified organic pathology of the reproductive organs. The theoretical structure supporting this practice was the same structure supporting every other physical intervention in the asylum's medical repertoire. Mental disorder was a physical disease. The physical disease had a physical location in the body, and identifying and correcting that location was a physician's appropriate response. The operating table occupied the same institutional position as the hydrotherapy basin and the dispensary cabinet. It was a site where the physician's authority over the patient's body reached its most complete physical expression, and what happened on it was called treatment because it was administered by a physician in a building whose stated purpose was to cure disease. At the far end of the century, the theoretical thread that had run from Russia's cerebrovascular excitation theory through the asylum's pharmaceutical sedation programs, Mitchell's nutritional nerve repair, and the gynecological surgical movement arrived at a formulation given its most extensive clinical expression by Henry Cotton, who became superintendent of the Trenton State Hospital in New Jersey in 1907. Cotton developed and applied the focal infection theory, the hypothesis that localized bacterial infection in specific body sites produced systemic toxic effects causally responsible for mental disorder, with a procedural thoroughness that no American physician of the previous generation had approached, removing from his patients' bodies the teeth, tonsils, stomach sections, cervixes, ovaries, and portions of the colon that he identified as harboring infections he considered responsible for their mental conditions. He reported recovery rates that, had they been accurate, would have represented the most significant advance in psychiatric treatment in the history of American institutional medicine. Phyllis Greenacre, conducting an independent review of Trenton's patient records in the early 1920s, found that the actual recovery rates among surgically treated patients were no higher than those of untreated patients at comparable institutions, and that mortality from a major abdominal surgical procedures was substantial. The treatment room, the hydrotherapy basin, the dispensary cabinet, the operating table. These were not separate domains governed by principles distinct from those that govern the ward corridor, the airing court, and the admission hall. They were the same institutional logic applied to the most intimate physical surface it could reach, which was the body of the person confined within the building, and the physician's authority over that body was, across the whole of the 19th century, as complete and as largely unreviewed as the institution's authority over the patient's time, their labor, their diet, and their correspondence. The treatments administered within that authority's reach ranged, over the course of the century, from the theoretically coherent and practically harmless to the medically uncertain and physically damaging to, in the most extreme cases, at the century's far edge, the lethal. What connected them across this range was not their physiological mechanism, not their theoretical coherence, and not their demonstrable clinical effectiveness, but the institutional position from which they were delivered, the position of a physician, in a building designated as a hospital, exercising over a confined patient the authority the institution had granted him. The physician superintendent occupied an office in the central administration block of the Kirkbride building, and the physician's daily clinical rounds, the visits to the wards, the reviews of case notes, the orders written in the dispensary ledger, were conducted on a schedule that the size of the institution and the demands of its administrative responsibilities made increasingly compressed as patient populations grew through the middle decades of the century. What occupied the wards during the hours between those rounds, during the 12 or 14 hours of each day when no physician was present in the corridor, was the attendant workforce, and the conditions under which that workforce operated were governed by institutional arrangements that had no equivalent within the medical hierarchy's own professional culture, and that the annual reports and professional literature of the period addressed with considerably less frankness than they addressed the physician's clinical authority. The men and women employed as attendants in American state asylums through most of the 19th century were drawn from the same labor pool as domestic servants, farmhands, and unskilled factory workers, and the wages offered reflected this equivalency without apology. Male attendants at most state institutions through the 1860s and 70s received between $8 and $12 per month plus room and board, a sum comparable to what an agricultural laborer could expect to earn and inferior to what a skilled tradesman commanded. Female attendants received somewhat less, between $5 and $9 per month in most institutions, and were housed in a section of the ward building separated from the patient areas by a single locked door. The working day for both male and female attendants typically ran to 12 hours, with a single day off each week and no provision for paid absence. In many institutions, attendants were expected to remain on the grounds during their time off and were housed in the institution's own accommodation, whether they were on duty or not. There was, in most institutions through the 1870s, no formal training program, no examination of qualifications, and no requirement that an applicant had any prior experience with the ill or the disordered. A new attendant was shown the ward routines by a more experienced colleague and was thereafter expected to manage whatever the ward presented. The ratio of attendants to patients, one for every 20 to 30 patients in the daytime, considerably fewer through the night, meant that a single individual was responsible during each shift for the physical safety, the behavioral management, the feeding and dressing and cleaning, and the general maintenance of order for a ward population whose individual conditions range from the mildly disoriented to the severely agitated and occasionally violent. The same attendant held, within that ward, an authority that was in practical terms nearly absolute. A patient who complained about an attendant's behavior presented that complaint to the ward physician, who had already certified that the patient's perception of reality was disordered, or to the ward supervisor, whose institutional standing depended on the smooth operation of the ward, or to the superintendent, who was rarely present in the corridor and who received any formal written complaint at a further remove from the event that had occasioned it. In most American institutions prior to the statutory reform efforts of the 1870s and 80s, there was no mechanism for independent external review of a patient's complaint, and the patient's account of any incident was evaluated within an epistemological framework that treated the testimony of the certifiably insane as inherently less reliable than the testimony of any member of the institutional staff. What this structural arrangement produced in practice was a pattern of attendant conduct that the surviving institutional record documents with consistency that no single institution's particular history can fully explain. The attendant who struck a patient with an open hand, with a closed fist, with a leather strap, or with whatever corridor in the day room offered, did so in a space where other patients were present as witnesses, but those witnesses were legally and institutionally disqualified from providing testimony that would be accorded the same weight as the attendant's own account of the same event. The attendant who administered a cold bath to a patient not as a prescribed hydrotherapy procedure, but as a response to a situation the attendant found irritating or threatening did so with full awareness that the distinction between the therapeutic shower bath and the punitive one was, in the written record, governed entirely by the account the attendant chose to enter in the nursing log. The patient's own version was a document produced by a disordered nervous system, as the institution's own certification of insanity established, and whatever that account claimed about the attendant's conduct was therefore available to be reclassified by those with institutional authority to do so as a symptom of the condition it purported to describe. The Utica State Lunatic Asylum, under the superintendency of John Purdue Gray from 1854 until his death in 1886, became in the final decades of that period one of the most discussed and most criticized institutions in the American asylum system in terms of its management of patients and its relationship to the non-restraint movement that had been reshaping English psychiatric practice since mid-century. Gray was in most respects a figure of considerable professional standing. He served simultaneously as superintendent and as editor of the American Journal of Insanity for more than 30 years, was a prolific contributor to professional literature on questions of diagnosis and institutional management, and was called as an expert medical witness at the trial of Charles Julius Goutel in 1881 and 1882, where he testified that Goutel, who had shot President James Abram Garfield, was legally sane, a position that placed him at the center of one of the period's most publicly contested medico-legal controversies. Gray's views on mechanical restraint diverged substantially from the direction in which English psychiatry had been moving since John Connolly had abolished all mechanical restraints at the Hanwell Lunatic Asylum in Middlesex in 1839 and published his account of the experience and its results in the treatment of the insane without mechanical restraints in 1856. Gray maintained that mechanical restraint, properly applied, carefully documented, and administered as part of a deliberate institutional program rather than as an attendant's improvised response, was in some cases a therapeutically superior alternative to the pharmaceutical sedation that was simultaneously expanding across American institutions, and Utica crib, which was in regular use at the asylum during his superintendency, was a device consistent with this position. The crib was a large slatted wooden frame placed over a patient's bed and fitted with a hinge lid that could be locked, enclosing the patient within the bed space and preventing them from rising during the night hours or at any other time the device was in use. Its dimensions approximated those of a standard institutional bed, and construction in heavy hardwood with slat space to allow air circulation reflected the engineering of a permanent institutional object rather than a temporary improvisation. In the institution's own records, it was described as a protective device intended for patients prone to nocturnal agitation, patients who attempted to leave their beds during periods of supervision, or patients whose behavior posed a risk to themselves or others when the ward was less than fully staffed. In the account of the reformers and investigators who inspected Utica through the 1880s, and in the broader literature of patient testimony and journalistic investigation that accumulated during that decade, it was characterized in terms that differed from the institution's own description in ways the professional literature found awkward to address and the reform literature found straightforward. The gap between what a building like Utica publicly presented and what its interior wards contained was not a condition first discovered by the reformers of the 1880s. It had been visible to careful observers for decades earlier. When Charles Dickens visited the United States in 1842 and published his observations as American Notes for General Circulation the same year, he recorded impressions of several American institutions, including the Perkins Institution for the Blind in Boston and the McLean Asylum in Charlestown, that were on balance more favorable than what he had observed in comparable English establishments. And his published account acknowledged what the American reform-oriented institution had accomplished in the decades since the founding generation. But his extended reflections on the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, where the system of solitary confinement was applied with a comprehensiveness that Dickens found genuinely and lastingly disturbing, articulated a concern about institutional architecture and human experience that applied with equal force to the asylum as to the prison. That what a building did to people inside, it could be entirely invisible from the street, and that the visitor who was received by the superintendent in the reception hall and shown the well-maintained four wards had not necessarily seen what the institution contained. The Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island, the narrow strip of land in the East River between Manhattan and the westernmost edge of Queens, where New York City had consolidated many of its public charitable institutions, housed several hundred patients drawn primarily from the city's immigrant and working-class population, and was administered by the city's Department of Public Charities and Correction under conditions of chronic underfunding that were periodically documented in official reports and periodically unaddressed by the legislative appropriations process. A grand jury inspection of the island's institutions in 1873 had noted conditions its published report characterized as a disgrace to a civilized community and had recommended both increased funding and closer administrative supervision. The recommendations resulted in modest partial implementation. The funding increase that followed was insufficient to alter the basic conditions of the wards, and the circumstances the grand jury had documented persisted to the following decade without fundamental change. Elizabeth Jane Cochran had been working under the pen name Nellie Bly for the Pittsburgh Dispatch since 1885 and arrived in New York City in 1887 seeking a position with a major metropolitan paper. She approached the New York World with a proposal to investigate conditions on Blackwell's Island not through official inspection channels, but from within the patient population by feigning mental illness, securing admission to the asylum, and documenting what she observed from inside the ward system. The world's editors, under the ownership of Joseph Pulitzer, authorized the investigation. Cochrane spent several days practicing the behavioral presentation she intended to maintain, then presented herself on the evening of the 22nd of September, 1887, at the temporary home for females on 2nd Avenue in Manhattan, where her conduct of the night was sufficiently alarming to the home staff to result in her being taken the following morning before a judge, who ordered a medical examination. The examining physician certified her as insane. A subsequent examination confirmed the finding, and she was transferred to Blackwell's Island on the 25th of September. The account Cochrane produced from her 10 days in the women's lunatic asylum documented conditions that confirmed, in specific and individuated terms, what the 1873 grand jury report had described in a more general language of official inspection. The food served to patients was, by her account, composed of rancid butter, cold tea, spoiled meat, and a lumpy grain preparation that a number of the women on her ward declined to eat, and the quantity provided was insufficient for a population required to perform the ward's daily physical routines. The baths administered on admission were cold, delivered without preparation or warning, and conducted without any accommodation for the patient's physical response to the experience. The attendant she observed on a ward she occupied handled patients with a routine physical roughness that she documented in specific incidents, taking women by the arm and dragging them when movement was considered too slow, administering strikes to patients who called out or resisted instruction, and maintaining through the night hours a pattern of ward disturbance that she characterized as making sustained sleep effectively unavailable. She described women she believed to be entirely sane, including several whose confinement appeared, in her observation, to be explicable primarily by the limited command of English that made their communication with examining physicians difficult, housed in the same wards as women with evident and severe mental disorder, with no clinical procedure applied to distinguish between them. The articles Cochrane published in the New York World beginning on the 9th of October, 1887, collected and issued the same year in book form as 10 Days in a Madhouse, produced a public response with a speed and a material consequence unusual for journalism of the reform variety. A grand jury was convened, Cochrane testified before it over several sessions, and the city increased its appropriation to the Department of Public Charities and Correction by approximately $1 million in the budget that followed. Certain conditions she had documented were directly addressed. Staffing levels were increased at specific points. The food provision was reviewed and improved in the months immediately following the investigation, and a number of attendants whose conduct had been identified by name or description in her account were removed from their positions. The superintendent of the women's lunatic asylum appeared before the grand jury and contested several of her specific characterizations, maintaining that what she had observed as attendant roughness was within the range of the physical management necessary for a patient population presenting acute behavioral disturbance, and that the women she had identified as sane had been certified by qualified examining physicians whose clinical judgment the institution was entitled to apply. The broader question, whether the conditions she had documented at Blackwell's Island were exceptional to that institution or representative of the state asylum system as it was operating across the country, received no formal institutional answer of any kind. What Cochrane's investigation established in the public record was something more durable than the specific improvements it produced at Blackwell's Island or the specific budget increase it generated from the city government. It established, in documented and widely circulated narrative form, that the experience of the patient within the institution was systematically inaccessible to the public discourse that funded and discussed those institutions from outside, and that this inaccessibility was not an accident or an oversight, but a structural feature of the institutional design itself. The patient who was struck in the ward corridor was in a space that no external observer had any routine occasion to enter. The patient's account of what had occurred in that space was received within a building whose medical hierarchy had already certified that the patient's perceptions were disordered. The only witnesses to the event were other patients whose testimony the same institutional framework had already disqualified from independent evidentiary weight. The architecture that Kirkbride had designed to present a legible and reassuring face to the approach road, the building that communicated, by its proportions and its citing, the order and purposefulness of what it contained, was precisely the architecture that rendered what it actually contained invisible to the people who wrote its annual appropriations and read its annual reports. The deaths that occurred in American asylums across the 19th century were recorded with a degree of accuracy that varied considerably across institutions and across the decades, and the causes entered in institutional mortality registers reflect both the genuine medical circumstances of a densely housed population and the limitations of what record-keeping, conducted under the supervision of the institution's own medical staff, was organized to document. Tuberculosis was endemic in many institutions by the 1870s. The combination of dense housing, limited ventilation, and wards holding far more patients than they've been designed for, inadequate nutritional provision, and the general physical deterioration that accompanied long-term institutional confinement created conditions in which the disease moved through a ward population with a speed that no available medical intervention could reliably slow. The annual reports of the Utica State Lunatic Asylum identified tuberculosis as the single most frequent cause of death among its long-term patients through the 1870s and 1880s, and the Willard Asylum's mortality figures showed comparable patterns from its earliest years of operation. These deaths were attributed to disease, which was accurate in the narrow sense that tuberculosis was the proximate cause of each one, and incomplete in the sense that the conditions of institutional confinement were the context within which the disease had spread, and the nutritional deficiency and physical deterioration of the patient population were the conditions that had made each individual most vulnerable to it. Deaths from causes other than identified infectious disease were recorded in most institutions with less clinical specificity. A patient who died following a fall in the ward corridor was entered in the mortality register as having died from injuries sustained in a fall, and the question of whether the fall had been accidental or had involved a physical encounter with an attendant was not in most institutions the subject of any formal investigation, since there was no body external to the institution withstanding to require one. A patient who died in the period immediately following a physical restraint procedure was recorded as dying from a cardiac or respiratory condition that the physician who signed the death certificate identified as the medical cause, and a restraint procedure that had preceded the death was typically absent from the official notation. The patients whose deaths the available institutional records found most difficult to account for in specific terms were those who had been classified as chronic upon admission, who had remained in the institution for years without any documented acute medical event, and whose death was entered under the general categories of exhaustion, debility, or decay, language that accurately named an end state without specifying either its cause or the institutional history of the years that had preceded it. The burial grounds associated with the major state institutions were established in most cases on the institution's own land at some distance from the main building, but within the physical boundary of the institutional grounds, and they were marked in a manner consistent with the institution's broader treatment of individual identity, not with names, but with numbered metal stakes or small numbered stones corresponding to entries in the patient ledger maintained in the administrative office. The Willard Asylum Cemetery on the western shore of Seneca Lake, which accumulated the graves of more than 5,700 individuals across the institution's operating period, was organized on this numbering system throughout. The Utica State Lunatic Asylum maintained a comparable burial ground on its grounds in the Mohawk Valley. The Government Hospital for the Insane at Washington extended its associated burial ground across a section of the institution's extensive grounds at St. Elizabeth's, and its organization reflected the same indexical arrangement. The number on a marker referred to a record in a ledger. The ledger was maintained in the administrative building, and the person whose body lay beneath that marker was accessible to history only through that record, a record that was, in some cases, damaged, relocated, or lost in the century, and more that followed the institution's founding. The cemetery was a final spatial extension of the ward's own architecture, a space ordered by institutional numbering, organized by institutional record-keeping, and placed at the institution's periphery, invisible from the public road and from the broader world that had authorized the construction of the buildings whose former patients lay within it. The distance between the physician's published account of what an institution did and the actual experience of the person confined within it had been present, as Pliny Earl and others had observed in professional literature with careful and qualified language, since the earliest decades of American asylum medicine. By the 1880s, that distance had widened beyond what careful and qualified language could any longer adequately bridge. The ward corridor with its regulated sight line, the airing court with its 12-foot walls, the locked door between the patient day room and the administrative wing. These were not incidentally the instruments of therapeutic program, but were simultaneously and inseparably the means by which a specific form of institutional life was rendered opaque to the public outside the building's walls. and by which the experiences of those who lived within it were held within the same enclosure that the building manuals had specified in such careful and principled and ultimately insufficient detail as the architecture of cure. The population enclosed within the walls of the American asylum at any given moment across the 19th century was not drawn, in proportional terms, from the full spectrum of American society, and the divergences between those who were committed and the broader population from which they came were not incidental features of the system that had produced them. They were expressions of the theoretical categories and administrative procedures through which commitment decisions were made, shaped by assumptions about domestic life, racial order, and social conformity that the medical profession of the period treated as scientific observation rather than as normative judgment. The ward corridor contained whoever the diagnostic categories produced, and the diagnostic categories were built from materials that extended considerably beyond any purely clinical understanding of mental disorder. What the asylum managed was not simply illness. It managed the social conditions that the dominant culture had identified as requiring management, and it used the language of medicine to do so. The theoretical framework that governed medical understanding of women's mental health had European origins that had been thoroughly naturalized into American clinical practice by the 1840s. The prevailing view, developed through a confluence of gynecological and neurological theory, and reproduced across the pages of American Journal of Insanity, with a frequency of settled consensus, held that women's physiology was organized around the reproductive system in ways that made the nervous economy constitutively more susceptible to disturbance than men's. The uterus and the ovaries were understood to exert a regulatory influence over the entire female nervous constitution, and any condition or behavior that disrupted this regulatory influence could produce mental disorder. Childbirth, menstruation, menopause, and the failure to marry or to bear children were each identified in the medical literature as potential occasions for nervous collapse and intellectual overexertion. The sustained pursuit of education or professional work requiring the kinds of mental effort that the male constitution was considered better equipped to sustain was identified as a particular danger, on the theory that energy directed to cognitive labor was diverted from the reproductive system, and that the resulting depletion expressed itself in nervous and mental instability. These were not fringe positions held by a minority of practitioners. They appear in the textbooks used in American medical schools and in the lectures of the most prominent clinicians of the period, and they governed the intake assessments of women who arrived at state institutions with consistency that the admission records document across institution after institution and decade after decade. The diagnostic categories applied to women who arrived at state asylums reflected this framework with an elaboration of clinical nomenclature, whose breadth was in itself a measure of how widely the framework cast its net. Hysteria, derived from the Greek word for uterus and carrying in its 19th century American application a range of meanings wide enough to encompass almost any pattern of female behavior the examining physician found excessive, resistant, or otherwise inconvenient, was among the most frequently recorded diagnoses in the women's wards of most institutions from the 1840s onward. Puerperal mania, a genuine and recognizable clinical condition in some of its presentations, was entered in admissions records alongside cases whose documentation made clear that the primary presenting condition was grief, exhaustion, or the acute distress of a woman who had lost an infant or was physically unwell in the postpartum period, but whose condition had not been distinguishable. In a brief admissions interview conducted by a physician whose time and whose interest in the patient's own account were both limited, from the disorder the diagnosis named, nymphomania, listed as both precipitating cause and clinical diagnosis in the admissions ledgers of multiple state hospitals, including the Utica State Lunatic Asylum and the Western State Hospital in Staunton, Virginia, encompass in the period's medical usage any expression of sexual desire or behavior on the part of a woman that the examining physician judged to exceed the decorous minimum, and the threshold was determined by the physician's own assessment of what a woman in the patient's social position ought to be experiencing, rather than by any standard the patient herself could have known or anticipated. The admission record that entered these diagnoses was a document on which the institution's therapeutic program was predicated, and the therapeutic program that followed was predicated on correcting the condition the diagnosis named, which was in each case inseparable from the social norm whose violation the diagnosis had been constructed to classify. The category of moral insanity which the Association of Medical Superintendents had incorporated into American diagnostic practice from James Cowles Pritchard's English formulation, and which had been discussed with approval in the American Journal of Insanity, since its founding year, found its most expansive application in the women's wards, where it served as a diagnostic instrument capable of reaching any pattern of conduct that deviated from the domestic norm without producing the kind of gross behavioral disturbance that other diagnostic categories required. A woman who refused to perform household tasks, who expressed views about her domestic situation that her husband or male relatives found disruptive, who persisted in intellectual or professional work that the medical literature associated with nervous danger, or who maintained, under institutional pressure, a set of social or political opinions that those around her found unreasonable. Any of these could constitute, under the moral insanity framework, sufficient clinical evidence for both admission and continued confinement. The framework did not require the physician to demonstrate that the woman's faculty of reasoning was impaired. It required only that he judge her active and moral faculties to be disordered, a judgment whose content was defined by reference to what a woman's active and moral faculties were supposed, in the period's social understanding, to produce. The circularity of the standard, in which the prevailing social norm defined the pathology and deviation from the norm constituted the diagnosis, was not addressed in professional literature with any sustained critical attention, because the medical profession that maintained that literature did not, on the whole, experience the circularity as a problem requiring resolution. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, whose 1892 story, The Yellow Wallpaper, became the most enduring literary document of what this diagnostic framework produced in the life of an individual woman, wrote in a subsequent essay that the story's purpose was not to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy. The story she had drawn from her own experience of Silas Weir Mitchell's Rest Cure, which is discussed in some clinical detail in the medical portion of this account, depicted a woman confined to enforce domestic passivity under a physician husband whose clinical authority over her was inseparable from his marital authority, watching the wallpaper of her room with an intensity that grew as her other faculties contracted under prescription of absolute inactivity. What the story anatomized was not simply the rest cure, but the broader medical framework that identified intellectual activity as dangerous to the female nervous system, and the institutional consequence of applying that framework to a woman who had built her sense of self around exactly the activity that the framework prohibited. The narrator of The Yellow Wallpaper is described by the physician who oversees her care as improving, and the story's force depends on a reader's capacity to hold simultaneously what the physician sees and what the reader sees, and to identify the gap between these two perceptions as the condition the story is examining. The racial organization of the American asylum system was, across most of the 19th century, consistent enough across regions and institutional types to constitute a structural feature of the system rather than a collection of local arrangements. In the southern states prior to the Civil War, enslaved black people were largely excluded from the white-administered institutions that provided care for the mentally ill on the theory, stated openly in professional literature and endorsed without evident discomfort by the mainstream of American asylum medicine, that the mental constitution of the enslaved was so different from that of the free white population as to require entirely different management understood to be the responsibility of the enslaver rather than of the state. Samuel Cartwright, a Louisiana physician who practiced in Natchez and in New Orleans, published in the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal in 1851 a paper formally titled Report on the Diseases and Physical Peculiarities of the Negro Race, in which he proposed two diagnostic categories specific to the black population that have since become among the most cited examples in the historical literature of the entanglement of medical authority with the apparatus of racial subjugation. The paper was reviewed in the American medical press without the dismissal one might anticipate of a claim this transparently structured to serve the social arrangements the author inhabited, which is itself a measure of how thoroughly those arrangements had penetrated the theoretical frameworks through which the medical profession of the period read the world. The first of Cartwright's proposed categories was drapetomania, which he defined as a mental disease producing in enslaved people an irresistible compulsion to flee from their place of confinement. He attributed its cause to the failure of the enslaver to maintain the appropriate authority relationship, an authority relationship he characterized in the paper as analogous to that of a parent with a child, and proposed as its treatment a combination of physical discipline and altered living conditions sufficient to restore the appropriate disposition of submission and dependence. The second was dysesthesia ethiopica, which he described as a condition producing in free black people a tendency toward what he called rascality and slothfulness, attributed to the absence of the governing authority that enslavement had provided and expressed in behaviors that he characterized as both medically symptomatic and socially disruptive. Both categories were constructed to classify as medical pathology exactly those behaviors that the slavery system required to characterize as pathological. The desire of an enslaved person to be free was, in Kirkbride's framework, a symptom of a disordered nervous system, and the physician who identified drapetomania was providing, through that identification, a scientific account of why the constraint of individuals seeking liberty was medically appropriate. The conceptual operation at work, the transformation of a social desire into a medical condition, was not fundamentally different in its structure from the operation being performed in the women's wards of the same period, where the desire to live outside the prescribed social role was classified through the available diagnostic categories. As evidence of the nervous and moral disorder those categories have been constructed to name. In the free states of the North and Midwest, black patients were admitted to state institutions with considerably more frequency than in the South, but the conditions of that admission were governed by patterns of racial segregation that reflected the broader social arrangements of the period rather than any clinical assessment of differential therapeutic need. At the Utica State Lunatic Asylum, the Willard Asylum in Ovid, and institutions across Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, black and white patients occupied separate ward spaces whose separation the institutional records documented without comment or justification, on the evident assumption that the arrangement required neither. The quality of provision in the separated black wards was, in most documented instances, inferior to that in the white wards of the same building. Ward rooms were smaller, dietary provision was of lower standard, staffing levels were less adequate relative to the patient population, and the therapeutic occupations and organized activities that each institution described as the basis of its curative program were available in the separated black wards with less regularity and in less variety than in the wards serving the white patient population. These differentials did not appear in the annual reports that the institutions submitted to their state legislatures, which described the institution's therapeutic program in terms implying uniform application across the patient population, and which provided the legislature with no instrument for asking whether the uniformity claimed in print corresponded to uniformity experienced in the wards. In Virginia, which had operated the oldest continuously functioning public psychiatric institution in the United States, the Eastern Lunatic Asylum at Williamsburg, founded in 1773. The period following the Civil War produced an explicit and formally organized separate system whose racial logic was more visible than the informal segregation practices of the northern institutions because it was expressed in the institution's founding mandate rather than in its internal ward arrangements. The Central Lunatic Asylum for the Colored Insane was established at Howard's Grove in Henrico County, Virginia, in 1869, the first publicly funded psychiatric institution in the United States designated specifically for black patients, and its founding followed directly from the Commonwealth's refusal to accommodate the increase in black patients seeking admission to the Eastern Lunatic Asylum at Williamsburg that emancipation had produced. The institution opened with a patient population transferred from Williamsburg and from county poorhouses across the state, and it was administered from its first years under conditions of chronic underfunding that were more severe and more persistently unaddressed by the Virginia legislature than the underfunding experienced by the Eastern Lunatic Asylum, serving the white patient population in the same years. In 1885, the Central Lunatic Asylum relocated to a larger facility in Dinwiddie County, near Petersburg, Virginia, which provided somewhat more physical space for its patient population while maintaining, without formal acknowledgement, the pattern of resource allocation that had characterized the institution since its founding at Howard's Grove. Across the southern states that established separate institutions for black psychiatric patients in the decades following the Civil War, among them Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, the pattern was consistent. Separate facilities, systematically inferior resourcing, and a patient population that received formal institutional designation as a subject of psychiatric care, without receiving the substance of it in any form approaching that available to white patients in institutions funded at standard rates. The theoretical framework available to justify this differential drew on the same body of medical literature that Kirkbride had contributed to in 1851, extended through the post-war period in arguments that described the black nervous constitution as requiring different management and producing different prognosis than the white one. And these arguments circulated in professional literature with enough regularity to provide, for those who wished to apply them, a medical account of why differential provision was not a deprivation, but an appropriate calibration of therapeutic resources to constitutional difference. The Kirkbride wings of the Central Lunatic Asylum at Petersburg extended from their central administration block in the same configuration that Kirkbride had specified in his 1854 treatise, and the airing courts were bounded by walls of the same height, and the ward corridors were proportioned to the same specifications. But the therapeutic program those specifications were designed to enable was not operating within them at the level of provision that had been available even in the overburdened, underfunded white institutions of the North. The most consequential internal challenge to the therapeutic claims of the American asylum system came not from investigative journalism or from the campaigns of committed individuals like Elizabeth Packard, but from within professional organization that had defined those claims and sustained them across 4 decades of annual reports and published proceedings. Pliny Earle, who had been among the 13 founding members of the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane in 1844, and who served from 1864 as superintendent of the State Lunatic Hospital at Northampton, Massachusetts, had spent considerable portions of 2 decades examining the statistical foundations of the cure rates that American asylum superintendents had published since the system's earliest years. What those annual reports had presented as evidence of the asylum's therapeutic effectiveness, Earle found, on close examination of the original case records, whose numbers underlay the published figures, to have been generated by methods of calculation that produced rates the raw data did not support. The professional implications of this finding were significant enough that Earle proceeded carefully, publishing his analysis in incremental papers in the American Journal of Insanity through the 1870s before consolidating the argument in his 1887 volume, The Curability of Insanity, a series of studies, which assembled the full statistical documentation and presented it with the measured precision of a man who has spent years anticipating the objections of the colleagues whose published claims he was systematically revising. The mechanism of inflation Earle had identified was simple in its operation and had been producing distorted figures in most cases without any deliberate intent to misrepresent. The superintendents who reported recovery rates of 70, 80, or in the celebrated instance of William All at the Ohio Lunatic Asylum, figures approaching 100% from recent cases in some years, were calculating their rates from the number of discharges classified as recoveries divided by the total number of admissions in the same period. A patient who was admitted in January, recovered and was discharged in March, deteriorated and was readmitted in June, recovered again and was discharged in August, and was readmitted a 3rd time in November was counted in this accounting as 2 recoveries and 2 admissions, a recovery rate of 100% from a set of cases that, in clinical reality, represented a single patient who had never achieved durable recovery. Samuel Bayard Woodward at the Worcester State Lunatic Hospital had published figures claiming that over 80% of recent cases were curable under proper institutional care, and these numbers had circulated through Dorothea Dix's legislative memorials and to the published annual reports that justified each year's state appropriation as an investment in a demonstrably effective therapeutic enterprise. Earle's corrections showed that the actual long-term outcome data, when the same patients were followed across multiple admissions and discharges rather than counted fresh at each institutional encounter, produced figures that bore no resemblance to the published institutional claims, and that placed the American asylum's therapeutic record in a very different relationship to the public investment it had received. The professional response within the Association of Medical Superintendents was measured and on the whole resistant, though the resistance expressed itself in procedural objections and methodological qualifications rather than in any sustained defense of the original figures, because the original figures, once Earle had shown how they had been generated, were no longer defensible by anyone who examined the arithmetic. The response of the state legislatures and the appropriations committees that funded the institutions was more consequential in material terms. If the asylum did not cure most of the patients it contained, the argument for funding the existing institutions at therapeutic rather than custodial rates was undermined at its foundation, and the shift toward lower per patient appropriations that had been underway since the 1860s could now be presented not as a deficiency to be remedied through increased funding, but as a rational calibration of expenditure to function. The therapeutic claim had been the justification for the walls. Once the therapeutic claim was statistically unsustainable, what remained was the walls, and the walls required rather less public expenditure to maintain than a genuine hospital required. What the institutions were actually doing in the final 2 decades of the century was operating as custodial facilities of a scale that the founders of American asylum medicine had neither anticipated nor designed for. The Manhattan State Hospital on Ward's Island in the East River, which grew through the 1880s and 90s to house several thousand patients, operated at a scale that made the physician-patient relationship Kirkbride had identified as a central mechanism of moral treatment not merely difficult, but structurally impossible. The superintendent of such an institution was the administrator of a large and complex physical enterprise, and the patients were a population to be managed rather than individuals to be treated, and the management instruments available were the ward schedule, the pharmaceutical sedation cabinet, the locked door, and the daily routine that had once been described as a therapy and had become an institutional end in itself. The Willer Asylum at Ovid, New York, had been founded in 1869 precisely to receive the chronic patients that other institutions could no longer accommodate within any active therapeutic frame, which meant that its custodial function was explicit from its first day and had never required the protective fiction of therapeutic optimism that the acute institutions had maintained across their earlier decades. These institutions continue to describe themselves in their annual reports as hospitals and to describe their programs as treatment, because the annual reports were submitted to the legislatures that funded them, and the language of treatment was a language in which public funding for such institutions was authorized and justified. Dorothea Dix died on the 17th of July, 1887, at the Trenton State Hospital in New Jersey, the first institution whose founding she had directly championed, which had been given her a suite of rooms in an administrative wing in recognition of that history, and which had become over the intervening 4 decades a physical embodiment of the distance between the vision that had produced it and the reality it had come to represent. She had lived long enough to see the institution she had built grow beyond their design capacity, to see the therapeutic optimism of their founding decade give way to the administrative exhaustion of overcrowded custodial management, and to observe, without any recorded public acknowledgement of the specific nature of what she was observing, the gap between what she had argued before 32 state legislatures and what those legislatures had built. She did not live to see Earl's collected corrections published in book form that autumn, nor to read Nellie Bly's account Blackwell's Island, which appeared in the New York World in October that year, and which described from inside the system Dix had spent her life constructing, the conditions that no founding document had intended and that the founding document's language had made structurally very difficult to address. The buildings that Dix's campaigns had funded continued to stand, and the Kirkbride wings continued to extend from their central administration blocks, and the airing courts continued to be used for the daily supervised outdoor period, and the ward corridors continued to be the routes along which attendants made their rounds and along which patients moved from their rooms to the day room and back again, in the regulated daily sequence that moral treatment theory had once described as the restoration of the rational rhythms of civilized life. The therapeutic language in which the system had been founded had not been formally retired. It appeared in annual reports and legislative testimony through the end of the century and beyond, because the institutions required public funding, and public funding was secured through the argument that the buildings were hospitals rather than holding facilities, and that argument could not be openly abandoned without dismantling the fiscal justification on which the entire enterprise rested. What had changed was not the language and not the buildings, but the relationship between the two, the degree to which the buildings could honestly be said to be doing what the language claimed they were doing, which was a degree to which the founding theory had specified that the buildings themselves were the cure, and the buildings were now very plainly not curing anyone, and were not, in most cases, being funded or staffed as though curing anyone was what they were principally for. The architecture of reform had become the architecture of containment, and the distance between these two descriptions was the measure of what the 19th century had built and what it had not. By the final year of the 19th century, the United States operated approximately 150 state hospitals for the mentally ill, housing a patient population that had grown from fewer than 10,000 in 1840 to something in excess of 100,000. This expansion bore no proportional relationship to any corresponding growth in therapeutic resources, staffing, or per patient expenditure, and had transformed American institutional psychiatry in ways that the founding generation's treatises had not anticipated and had in some cases explicitly warned against. The language of cure survived in the official record long after the conditions that might have justified it ceased to obtain, because the annual reports were submitted to legislatures that required, in the documents they reviewed, some account of therapeutic purpose. The buildings were called hospitals to the end of the century and beyond, and that word continued to do the work it had always done, which was to secure the public funding that the word for what the buildings had actually become would not have obtained. The Kirkbride structures outlasted the intellectual framework that had produced them by margins that varied across states and across decades of shifting political priority and fiscal constraint. Many continued to house patient populations through the first half of the 20th century, under conditions that changed with each generation's pharmaceutical options and each legislature's allocation decisions, until deinstitutionalization policies, accelerating after 1954, reduced resident populations to fractions of their former size. Some buildings were demolished in the decades following closure. Others survive as decommissioned structures whose Italian facades and extended staggered wings are now the concern of historic preservation organizations rather than of medical ones. The cemeteries are the most durable remnant. At the Willard Asylum on the western shore of Seneca Lake, more than 5,700 number markers stand in ground that the institution maintained across the full span of its operation, and in recent years, researchers and family members have worked to reconnect those numbers to the names recorded in the surviving administrative ledgers, work that the record-keeping system had always made theoretically possible, but that no one within the institution had found reason to undertake. The names were in the ledgers, alongside the numbers, through every decade of the institution's existence. They had been there all along. Sitting with this script now that it is fully written, I feel two things pretty clearly, and I would rather say both of them than pretend only one exists. What I am genuinely proud of is the architectural thread. The decision to run the building as treatment, as a central recurring argument, not just as context, gave this script a spine that I think separates it from most content in this space. The easiest version of this topic is the Gothic version. The restraints, the cold baths, the coffin cribs, presented in sequence for their surface horror. This script refused that, and I think it was the right refusal. When you trace how a corridor width or a ward classification express the same ideological assumptions as a commitment statute or a diagnostic category, you are doing something that actually illuminates history rather than just displaying it. That feels worthwhile in a way that pure shock does not. Elizabeth Packard is the strongest individual narrative thread in the entire script, and I think it earns every word given to it. Her case is specific enough to be emotionally legible, legally precise enough to be intellectually serious, and historically consequential enough to carry the weight placed on it. The plenty oil statistical correction material is the other piece I am genuinely satisfied with. An internal institutional demolition of the founding therapeutic claims, conducted with the patience of a man who spent decades preparing for the moment. That is a genuinely remarkable historical episode, and I think the script treats it with the seriousness it deserves. Now, where I am less certain. Section 4, which covers the medical treatments in full, occasionally reads more like a catalog than a narrative. The accumulation of compounds and procedures, bromide, chloral hydrate, paraldehyde, the surgical programs, is historically accurate and documented, but risks feeling like a list in a way the other sections do not. A more aggressive editorial hand might have cut a third of that material and redistributed the space into either the gender analysis or the mortality discussion, both of which could have held more room, without losing anything. I also think the racial organization of the asylum system arrives too late. Cartwright and the Central Lunatic Asylum at Petersburg belong in Section 6 thematically, but the racial structure of the system was present from its founding moment, not just in its maturity. Weaving it into the admission procedures of Section 2 and the ward labor section 3 would have made it feel less like a chapter added at the end, and more like the foundational structural feature it actually was. The closing is right. The image of the numbered markers at Willard, and the observation that the names have in the ledgers all along, that is the ending the script earned. I believe in it. But 320 words is a short runway after everything the preceding sections build, and a listener who has stayed with this material through to the end of section 5 deserves those final minutes to settle into something that breathes a little more slowly than it does. Both things are true. This script is genuinely good, and it has specific places where it could have been stronger. I would rather say both than pretend the second one away. If something landed differently for you than it did for me, if a section I am second-guessing was the one that held your attention, or if something I am satisfied with fell flat when you heard it, tell me in the comments. That conversation is the part of this work I actually learn from.